On the 15th of September 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened as the first passenger-carrying railway in the world. This would trigger the railway age. In London, the capital of the British Empire and Europe's largest city, this would lead to massive changes as the railway companies scrambled to serve the city. However, the city authorities resisted demands to build stations inside the city's central districts, and instead the terminals formed a ring around the city. In 1863, the Metropolitan Railway would trigger the Underground Age, as the first underground passenger railway in the world was opened to connect these terminal stations to the city centre. Today in Rails to Nowhere, we begin looking at the history of London Underground, its origins, and the origins of commuting as its very concept. Hello and welcome to Rails to Nowhere. My name is Simon, and as ever I'm joined by Ella.
Hello.
And today we are indeed talking about my dissertation. We're starting a epic 10-episode series. Ella's pulling faces at the idea we might ever get that recorded, on my dissertation research into the response of London transport to the emergence of the motorcar in the 1930s. So we're drawing on quite a lot of in-depth research that I've done for my MA. We're covering most of the topics that I cover in my actual MA thesis, plus a little bit outside of the scope of what I could fit inside that thesis, just because there's a little bit of background stuff that I took for granted in my thesis, but that's kind of important for us to talk about in this series. This episode specifically doesn't really feature in my MA, it's more sort of the background for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with London Underground history as I am. So today we're talking about the growth of the Underground, its emergence from the mid-1800s, and how it impacts the city a little bit in the late 19th century to sort of set the stage, because we're mostly, this series is going to be talking about the 1920s and 30s, but we need to understand this sort of first 50 years of the Underground, which we're going to fly through today.
It's probably worth at this point pointing out that today the tube only refers to the London Underground lines. They are the ones that appear on the tube map themselves and generally are not done as two parallel lines. These are the solid ones.
Yeah.
There are other things on what we would now call the tube map, but the tube, at least as we're going to be discussing it, will only refer to these original lines and original companies, not extra systems like the DLR, Overground, Thameslink.
Yeah.
And other systems that have been added on. Even though a lot of people do refer to these other systems as part of, quote, the tube, they are not going to be referred to as part of this.
We're talking pretty much anything that was on the tube map sort of pre-2000, excluding the DLR, which I know was on the tube map by that point. So I said that this was what I'd studied for my MA thesis, which means that this is something I've looked at in detail, and part of the detailed research I've had to do is justify why it is I would talk about this, why this is something we need to talk about. That's something you have to do with any sort of study like this, is you have to think about, well, why is this a relevant topic of study? And I think it's quite an important bit of discussion, because we're really talking about undoing a lot of what happened in the 1920s and 30s, or what started in the 1920s and 30s right now. We've got things like low traffic neighbourhoods, 15-minute cities, all of that sort of in the news right now, and that's the sort of stuff that begins to disappear in the 1930s, because driving everywhere is not the default state for urban transport for the vast majority of cities' existences.
No, it's important to remember the motor car has been only around in public accessibility since really the end of the First World War, as a thing that most people can actually purchase and access as a form of transport. Prior to this, yes, they did exist, but it was generally preserved for very well-off people rather than what we would now describe as an average middle-class person. Because don't forget, those are the main targets of a system like the Underground as well, not your working class people who are working manual jobs. These are people who are commuting in and doing that sort of work.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the motor car in a later episode, but yeah, they generally don't exist. They come into existence, actually, interestingly, the first motor cars come into existence broadly the same time as the railways are first developing, but they don't become marketable to many people until post-First World War. Obviously, we always like to throw around the Ford Model T as the turning point. It's actually much more complicated than just the Model T appears,
Yes.
which we'll talk about in a later episode. But that's the good sort of benchmark. It's the early 1920s where it really begins to take off. We're also in kind of a significant year for talking about London Underground history, railway history generally, ownership of railways, because we're 160 years from when London Underground first opens. So the Metropolitan Railway opens in 1863, which is 160 years ago this year. We are on the anniversary of the foundation of London Transport in 1933 as well. So that's 90 years ago that the London Passenger Transport Act is passed and London Transport comes into being. We're also the anniversary of the foundation of the Big Four and British Rail.
Yep.
So it's kind of pertinent to be talking about railway ownership, nationalisation, because London Transport goes from being private companies before 1933 to what we term a quango today, I guess, in 1933. It's an interesting organisational structure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a slightly later episode when we get to talking about the passage of the London Passenger Transport Act. And we're also in the midst of the attempts to form or discussions about the formation of Great British Railways, which is the potential next iteration of mainline operations. So I think it's really interesting to be talking about how urban transport's developed, what's some of the thinking that's happened in the past regards ownership, nationalisation, all of that sort of stuff, and sort of moving the conversation forward by looking at how we've ended up where we have.
It's very much a good time to be thinking about how we conceive of transport as well. Obviously, with all the environmental concerns that are going on, as well as systems like HS2 also being built, it's certainly worth thinking, how do we consider transport from every single level, because what we currently have is generally believed to be unsustainable.
Yeah, so it's very important that we're sort of thinking about the future, but as we discuss in our historiography bonus episode, you can't really think about the future without understanding the past, which on that note, we should talk a little bit about the literature that kind of exists. We're not going to do a full-on literature review for the topic. We'll talk a little bit more about the literature that does and doesn't exist and the strengths and weaknesses of it as we go through. I thought about having this episode as basically being my introduction to my dissertation and sort of have a full-on 2,000-word literature review, and I thought that might not sit so well with our audience. It's probably a little heavier, too academic for what we're trying to do here. But we'll have a sort of overview and we'll talk a little bit more about stuff as it crops up as we go through the series.
And to the academics listening, if you do want the heavy details, check the notes. There's stuff in the notes.
Yep.
And also hop on the Patreon. There will be things on there, obviously.
Yep. And you can email us at contact@railstonowhere.co.uk. I'll put that in the notes as well if you want to get a more detailed list of the sources I used for my dissertation. So London Transport, like British Rail, like a lot of railway history, it's got a lot written on it. London Transport specifically has loads of stuff written on it, but a lot of it falls into two categories. You've either got technical stuff written about it, so you've got things written about how trains work and how the underground functions, how train stops work. We talked about train stops in our last episode, how the electrical system functions and all of that, which is all well and good, but it doesn't really give us any sort of analytics on the history. It's just sort of giving us facts and figures of when lines open, how the technical stuff functions. And you've also got a lot of sort of descriptive history. So you've got books like Rails Through the Clay by Alan Jackson, which is basically just here's a list of when everything's happened. And those, don't get me wrong, those are useful, they have their place. But again, they're not giving us the analytics. That's where the vast majority of writing on London transport history exists. Partially because it is designed for a sort of more consumer audience and a general interest history, which is fine. That has its place within the discourse. But what London Underground history and London transport history more widely sometimes suffers from is a lack of analytical history and sort of tying it together with the exterior forces that are going on. In our last series on technology, I'm always talking about politics and the exterior forces that are occurring, and we're going to cover that again a bit in this because it's important to understand how the railway is placed within the world.
Yes, these systems are not isolated systems. The world is not a series of isolated machines.
Yeah.
And by placing these things into the wider context, hopefully hopefully, we're giving people a bit more of an understanding of how they worked, why they didn't work, and potentially where we might be able to take them in the future.
Yeah, and the other limitation on a lot of London transport history.
Well, thank you for listening to this preview of Rails to Nowhere. For the full episode, head over to the Rails to Nowhere YouTube channel or search Rails to Nowhere on your podcast platform of choice.